think you've heard me mention that I have just started a new season with our prayer group, and the prayer focus will be the field partners of CBM in Europe. And we're currently in Germany, and the people that they are reaching out to, these field staff are reaching out to, and they may not be what you think. So I began looking into things that might connect these unseemingly unrelated people groups. Well, seek and you shall find. I find them in historical milestones and happenings, and I'm going to reveal some of my findings in the upcoming prayer group meetings. Now, through these researches, I also came across something that is quite fascinating, and it's about tea. Any tea lovers among us? Now, ancient tea trees are prized, and they are like treasured possessions. And I saw in a documentary about a tiny place tucked in the diverse environment and the province of Yunnan, which is in mainland China. And this minority people group known as the Lahu people. The Lahu people living in high mountains, and they were known for originally being great tiger hunters in the past. But in recent years, probably either because they are protecting tigers rather than hunting, or tigers are no longer a problem to them, they have turned to guarding something else, the ancient tea trees that they have been living with and amongst their people for thousands of years. Now, the documentary shows one of these trees, which is believed to be over 1,000 years old. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of types of teas. And even if we are not talking about English teas, Sri Lankan teas, Japanese teas, and just talking about the Chinese teas, we would still be here tomorrow. And so, I would just talk about one type. When I was a young child, going out to dim sum, and some of us have gone to dim sum restaurants, more recently than I have actually, in places like Calgary. Now, but in Hong Kong, when we were going out to dim sum, it's just as common as going to a coffee shop or an eatery or a diner in North America here. Not much has changed about this beloved activity over the years. Now, when you sit down at the table, the server will come to you. The server will come to you, and the first thing they ask you would be, what kind of tea you want me to bring to you? Now, my father would almost always, order a tea called pu-erh. Pu-erh. Pu-erh is not a white tea or green tea, but it's a black tea, and it's not a red tea either. It has a uniquely nutty, sweet flavor. Also, pu-erh tea is an aged tea. So, intrigued by the history and the culture and the science behind pu-erh tea, I continued to look into it. And I found that the ripe kind of pu-erh tea has to wait 10 to 30 years for the raw tea to mature and to achieve the aged flavor. So pu-erh can be stored and has to be stored and permitted to age and to mature under a very meticulous and controlled process of fermentation. And that's one of the reasons why it is thought to have various positive health benefits. Now, like wine, pu-erh is stored and permitted to age like this in non-airtight containers before consumption. And that is why it has long been a standard to label all types of pu-erh tea with the year and the region of production. Just to give you an example, pu-erh tea is so prized that if it is a really, really fine specimen, you can buy it just 5 grams, a teaspoon full of a sample for as much as around $50 for 1 teaspoonful of fine pu-erh tea. If you want to buy a tea cake, 390 grams, so less than 400 grams, but packed with pu-erh tea leaves, it costs you about between $1,000 to over $3,000 US. Now, first-class pu-erh tea, as I mentioned about the Yunnan province, it's actually originated from this Yunnan province. And something like this kind of tea, under an expert's care, going through this kind of non-airtight containers, mature process, makes me think of Jesus' parable, the one that we've just read about the old wine and the new wine. So, Mark chapter 2, verses 21 to 22. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine, so it's like juice still like juice, not fermented yet, right, into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the new wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. So Jesus uses these 2 illustrations. One is about the old or the new cloth, or the old cloth on another garment. But what it actually means is that cloth that has already gone through being shrunk, and cloth that hasn't, the unshrunk kind. Now the second illustration is about the old wine and the new kind, and the difference between them when they are being stored. Now this parable is also mentioned in Matthew chapter 9, verse 16 to 17, and also in Luke chapter 5, at the end of that chapter, verses 36 to 39, as well as in Mark, as we have just read. Now in Luke's description, there's something, if you've read it, there's something special about it at the end. Although the parable is told in the same way as Matthew and as in Mark, but only Luke gives us an observation in the conclusion of it. In verse 39 it says, "No one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for they say, the old is better." So why this conclusion? The context is this. Well, we can always go back to Mark 2, in verse 18, like the beginning of the passage that we read before the sermon. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and so some people came to Jesus and asked him, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" And Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have the bridegroom with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. So it just goes to show that the people that were asking Jesus the question, probably including Pharisees, they were just finding an excuse to accuse Jesus. Finding an excuse just to put Jesus down. But Jesus goes on and he mentions two things. He sees through these people, and so he goes on to teach them, using these two focuses in the parable. Now the first one about garment. So it's about the outside. Outside. People usually just look at the outside. Like people always look at the clothes they wear, the outward appearance, right? One of the first things that we would see of a person is the clothes. The clothes one wears, the material that needs to be, that you use to make the clothes that you wear. So, Jesus used the two different kinds of cloths, right, to make a parable, to make an illustration. New cloth has to be stretched, has to grow, and also has to go through shrinking or not processes. But old garments cannot stretch with the new cloth. So probably he's also referring to the Pharisees still being proud of their old way by trying to keep God's laws by themselves and not really relying on God to help them to go through each day to please God. Because you really cannot, by your own efforts, earn your own righteousness before God, right? This righteousness of God, of Jesus, is like the garment that we wear. I've talked about Romans in one of the past sermons, so I'm not going into the detail, but Paul asks us to wear Jesus as a garment. And that means that wearing Jesus' righteousness on us so that we can truly love God and serve God and people. But today our focus would be on the second one. The next thing Jesus wants to use to emphasize his focus is another common thing that the people can relate in their lives and in their context. The beverages that people drink, grape juice or wine, and what is used to store these beverages, these wines. So we have the old wine and the new wine. So the new wine, I already mentioned that it needs to grow, and we'll talk about that later throughout the sermon. But instead of emphasizing the garment, the outside, like the clothes one wears, Jesus is turning his focus, or he's trying to help us to focus on our inside, our inner life. So if the new wine is the life that we live with Jesus leading us, that means his Spirit is in us, guiding us. So the new wineskin can be likened to the vessel holding our new life as well. And a lot of times we use the heart, right? We use the term the heart when we want to say that the Spirit is at work in us. We'll say the Spirit is at work in our hearts. Of course, by the word heart, we are not referring to the physical organ that's beating in our chests, right? We are referring to our minds, our souls, our intellect, our wills, and sometimes our spirit as well. So for us to try describe God's Spirit is moving in or talking to us, or so a lot of times, for lack of a better term, we would always say that He is changing our hearts or speaking to our hearts. God is omnipresent. That means He's everywhere, of course. And God is omnipotent. That means He's all-powerful. And God is omniscience, which simply means He's all-knowing. No doubt about that, right? And no problem with Him. But what if our own hearts want to remain in an old belief system and think that we will be fine in the end? Or we think that we are comfortable with what we are used to. That kind of hearts might be old hearts, might be old vessels, might be old containers, might be old wineskins. Like the people that were challenging Jesus in this story. So we need new containers that will allow our new lives with the Spirit of God to grow, to mature. Because just as the old container, in this case, the old wine skin, cannot expand according to how the new wine will bubble up, will ferment, will grow and expand as it ages and as it matures. So Jesus reminds His followers that in this case, what will happen in this scenario is that the old wineskin will eventually burst and ruin the new wine that's being put inside. So, a new wineskin is a must when it comes to hold, to store, and to allow the new wine aging and maturing process. So this helps to illustrate that whether it is through reading His Word, or through listening to a message, or through living our lives, we do need to have our hearts examined. Whether it is our old heart that is still leading us in this moment without Jesus, or whether our hearts have Jesus inside this moment through His Spirit, and therefore we will not reject or repel or expel the Spirit's prompting and His work in us, like the old wineskin will burst. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, His word reminds us that, see to it, brothers and sisters. The writer is talking to Christians, people who believe in Jesus, that none of you has a sinful and unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. Now the old wineskin, the old heart, will turn away from God when things are not smooth sailing. Like when it's under life's pressures or hardships or temptations, and that sort of thing. But on the contrary, the new wineskin is very suited to store the new wine, so that the new wine can go through this fermentation process, like the raw green pu-erh tea leaves will age in time. And during this process, maintaining and storing the wine, here in this case, in a new wineskin will allow this new wine to mature, and so it will not burst or destroy. Both to be destroyed, the wine, the new wine, and the wineskin, right? When we have a new heart, that won't happen. Even though physically we still have the same hearts as before, but now Jesus is living in our hearts. And as a result, our new life in Christ will have room to grow. We'll have room to go through the maturing process. And also like in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. So let us be reminded that a sincere heart with faith in God will be cleansed of our guilty conscience. Our heart knows that we are forgiven by God. That's what it means. Through Jesus, we don't need to feel guilty all the time. This is our new wineskin that can start and begin to hold the new wine in us. And such a heart, cleansed of a guilty conscience, the Spirit of God can truly reside in and can work through moment by moment, day by day. But the problem is always this. No one seems to like new wine once they have drunk the old or the aged wine. Actually, Luke has helped us spell it out. He says, no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. Isn't it right? Luke included this point at the end when he recounted Jesus' saying that Jesus understood already that it is like this to most of us. The old is better, or we can say we like what we are used to. We like what we are comfortable with. That is what we prefer. And most of us, we do prefer to stick with the familiar. What is familiar to us, we prefer, right? Nothing wrong there. Nothing wrong. But we need to know, is that what we will cling onto? What does our heart say when there are times, let's say, when the staff of the dim sum restaurant comes out to inform us that there's no pu-erh available to us that day? Will we throw a tantrum because we don't get what we are familiar with? Our inner heart of hearts should be what we take care of the most, all the time. And it is not an easy thing for any of us, because we are flawed human beings. Or do we prefer what feels to us as most comfortable or more acceptable in the world? Sometimes it is. Socially, materially, or we prefer to invest most of the things in the world that we can see. Or do we start to focus on storing up something that we cannot see? Treasures in heaven, so to speak, as Jesus encouraged his people to store up treasures in heaven. So even when something is uncomfortable to our hearts at the time or at the moment, but we know that it is the Spirit's tugging, that is the Spirit's influence, then we need to calm down, to take it, to accept it, and to go with it. It's easier said than done. And there's certainly not once and for all thing. This is certainly not a once and for all thing. But this is the way to God's house when we eventually leave this world. So, what are you most comfortable with? But you know that God might have been already tugging at your heart, that perhaps it's time for you, even when it is uncomfortable to your heart. Yet you know it is the Spirit's guiding, or is the Spirit voice, influence talking to you. You need to accept God's leading and go with Him. Have faith and trust Him to help you to move forward, even though for now it will be uncomfortable and it will be unfamiliar. But when you're willing to take that step out of, so to speak, your comfort zone, He will surely hold your hand and carry you with Him to new growth and new expansion, like new wines and new teas. As Hawk comes back to the music now, and he's going to play quietly for a few moments, maybe we can quietly talk to God, or quietly write down, there's some new pens on your pews, and what God and what you think and what you perceive as God has been tugging on your heart to make a change in your inner life this year. And have a quiet moment before Him and pray to Him. We will all do that. And after that, I will come back and we will learn a new song as our closing song today. I know that every time when we are willing to lean on Him and to move out of our comfortable territory, He will carry us with Him to new heights, to new growth as His body, and new depths of knowledge of Jesus Christ, His wisdom, and His love.